In this video, you'll get a basic introduction to painting shadows and highlights in watercolor. We'll learn more about this subject in later videos. For this lesson, you'll need the Shadows and Highlights practice template from our class page, transferred to a 1/16 sheet of watercolor paper taped to your painting support. You'll also need a pencil and eraser, and your angle shader and a paper towel or facial tissue. Artists use the word value to refer to how light or dark something is. There are many different scales that people use for values, but for the purposes of this video, we'll just need to refer to light values, middle values, and dark values. First, let's look at some shadows to get a basic understanding of how shadows help create the illusion of form and how light bounces around in a scene, and most importantly, to start to attune our eyes to looking at the pattern of values of light and dark. We think of shadows as being gray, but actually they're often not just pure gray. Look how much green is in the shadow cast by the ball here, and on the shadow on the back of the ball. That green is light reflected from the green wall to the left. You can think of the color of a shadow as being made up of four things: reflected light from the object casting the shadow, reflected light from colored objects nearby, the color of the surface that the shadow is falling on, and the color of the light illuminating the scene. This first encounter with shadows, we'll work with a white light and a white surface so that we only have to think about the color of the object and the objects nearby. Sometimes, especially at the beginning, we're fooled by color and see bright colors as lighter and dull colors as darker. So let's begin by looking at a black and white version. We have to consider both the shadows cast by the object, but also the ones on the object itself. Those are the ones that suggest three-dimensional form. You might think that the form shadow just gets darker and darker as you go around to the side away from the light, and then the darkest shadow of all would be the cast shadow. But this is usually not the case. It's that reflected light thing again. On the orange, the light is from the upper left. Notice that the right side of the orange has a little soft highlight. That's light reflected from a nearby wall. On the lower side of the orange, we can see light reflected from the tabletop. The darkest part of the form shadow is here, where there's nothing much reflecting back into the shadow. Notice also that the cast shadow is not uniformly dark. It's darkest in a little sliver directly under the object, and then it becomes lighter and softer edged as it moves away. The skills we learned in the video on achieving soft edges will be very helpful for creating shadows, and you'll see that the way that watercolor tends to mingle and run helps us with the color in the reflected light. We'll start with the first ball on the upper left on our template, and we'll make this one gray so we can think just about light and dark first. Whenever I'm learning a new painting skill, I like to arrange things so I can deal with just one difficulty at a time. I want to have a small highlight on the light side about here. I'm going to make just a teeny little faint dot with my pencil to help me place the highlight. First, I'll mix a nice puddle of strong neutral gray so that I don't have to stop and remix halfway through the process. Now I'll take a bit of this gray and dilute it to a lighter gray. I'm going to paint this light gray over the entire ball except the highlight. And without stopping, I'm going to go right across the lines and paint the shadow too. I'll make it all one wash, one area that is covered with wet color all at the same time, even if it happens to cross boundaries between things. Now while this is all still wet, I'm going to come back with a darker gray and make a curved stroke for the form shadow on the ball, using the wet into wet method we learned in the last lesson on soft edges. Now also while this is still wet, I'm going to add some darker color to the shadow and let it blend softly out. Some of it will likely run up into the ball, and that's good. It helps suggest the shadow side without being too dark. Now let's try one more gray ball, now that we've seen the process. Remember, different paper, brushes, pigments, and humidity can change how much the paint moves. So don't worry if yours doesn't look exactly like mine. Also, keep in mind anytime you have more color than you want in an area, you can use a thirsty brush to drink up the excess. Now let's try a blue ball. I'm using cobalt, but you could use ultramarine or whatever blue you happen to have. Use the blue to paint the ball minus the highlight as before. When you get down into the shadow, switch to a mid-value gray, but still paint right across the lines and make your shadow while the ball is still wet. Now I can hear some of you thinking, the blue's going to run into the gray, and that's true, and it's good, because that mingling of colors is going to suggest the reflected light. Even if it seems like it's happening way too much, just let it be, let it happen. Now use a bluish gray to make your form shadow and to deepen the cast shadow as before. You may have noticed that the edge of a cast shadow gets softer as it gets farther away from the object casting the shadow. If you have time, you can try softening the distant edge of the cast shadow while it's still wet. If you run out of time, no worries. You can still soften the edge later after it's completely dry using the last method we learned in the previous lesson. Now let's try another blue ball in the next row, but in this one we'll learn another way to create the highlight. I'm going to twist my paper towel or tissue into a little point and have it ready in my non-dominant hand. Now we'll paint the ball, this time including the highlight. And then, using your paper towel, you can blot a bit of the color off the page. This makes a softer highlight than the highlights we had in the previous row. You may have to blot more than once to get the look that you want. Then we continue as before, going down into the shadow with our gray, allowing the blue from the ball and the gray in the shadow to merge. Paint our form shadow as we did before, and drop a little color into the cast shadow. And again, if you still have time, you can try softening the far edge of your cast shadow. Now let's try this last example. We'll make one ball red and the other blue, and you guessed it, we'll paint both balls and both shadows as one wash, changing colors, but not stopping to let things dry at the lines between different things. For the form shadow on the red ball, I'll use a slightly grayed red. And a blue-gray on the blue ball. A little of that reddish gray underneath the red ball, and then as I begin to move towards the blue ball, I'll switch to more of a bluish tone in my shadows. Oh, look, I forgot to put a highlight on my blue ball. Well, we can just use the method we learned in the previous example, and we'll just lift that with a paper towel. Now we need to let everything dry before we can do our second layer. Okay, so now that everything's dry, let's separate the objects from their shadows and from each other with a few small brush strokes. I'll take a neutral gray, about a medium value, and paint a little crescent-shaped brush stroke right under the ball here in the shadow. And then, blotting my brush, I'm going to just soften the outside edge of that and let it gently blend into the shadow. And that's all it takes to separate the ball from the shadow and make it look like a three-dimensional object sitting on a surface. Now that you've seen the process, go ahead and practice it again on the remaining individual balls. Now let's separate the red and blue ball from each other. It's awkward to paint at this angle, so remember you can always turn your board around so that you can work more comfortably. In this shadow, I would see both the red color of the ball and the blue reflected light from the nearby blue ball, so I'll use a slightly purplish tone to make my shadow shape on the red ball. Again, I make a little crescent-shaped brush stroke, and then I'll rinse and blot my brush and soften this edge as it moves around the side of the ball. To separate these two balls from their shadows, I'll start with that purplish tone underneath the red ball where there would be both red and blue reflected light. And then as I work my way around underneath the blue ball, I'll gradually change to a more bluish gray. As a final touch, if you feel your highlight is too hard-edged or you want to soften some of your shadows, you can use your angle shader, or sometimes a round is better for a very small shape like this, and soften it a bit using the method from the last video. As you can imagine, trying to soften this edge while it was wet would have been pretty difficult. So it's a good thing we can soften edges after they're dry. Watercolor makes it easy to suggest soft edge shadows and reflected light. Just remember to connect things with their shadows or with adjacent things as you lay your washes, so the mingling of colors will suggest reflected light for you. Then separate them into different things later with small brush strokes suggesting the darkest portion of the shadow.